December 8, 1941. Vimanalo Beach, Oahu, Hawaii. The sand burned against Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki's face. He clawed at the shore, barely conscious, as the surf broke over his battered body. In his soggy uniform pocket, a small diary had words that, if his own officers found them, would get him killed on the spot. I have failed the Emperor. I have brought dishonor to my family for 10,000 generations. Death is my only path to redemption. With salt stinging his eyes, he saw a rifle barrel aimed at his head. An American soldier stood over him, silhouetted by the soft dawn. Sakamaki closed his eyes, bracing for the shot that would end his shame. Instead, the American spoke, words that shattered everything Sakamaki thought he knew about the enemy. "You're safe now. We'll get you medical attention." Corporal David Akwai from the 298th Infantry had just captured the first Japanese prisoner of war in American hands. Sakamaki, convinced surrender meant torture and execution, just like the Japanese propaganda had drilled into him, waited for pain and death. Instead, he heard English gentle and practical. He didn't know it yet, but his capture kicked off a chapter in World War II that nobody could have predicted. The slow unraveling of Japanese military indoctrination, one act of unexpected kindness at a time. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. held about 5,000 Japanese soldiers in camps on American soil, and thousands more ended up in Australia and New Zealand. All told, Western allies captured somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 Japanese POWs, a shockingly small number, given how brutal and sprawling the Pacific War became. Every one of those men expected beatings, torture, death. But the one shipped to America found something else entirely: hot showers, steady meals, doctors, and protections promised by the Geneva Convention. The kindness undid them. It left them more shaken than any cruelty ever could. They couldn't make sense of it. The Imperial Japanese military code didn't bend. Die before dishonor. Win or be destroyed. Surrender wasn't even an option. The 1941 Field Code, handed to every Japanese soldier, didn't mention what to do if captured. Why would it? A real Japanese warrior fought to the death or died by his own hand. That wasn't just talk. It was drilled into every recruit from day one. At the Imperial Naval Academy, where Sakamaki trained, officers reminded cadets over and over, "Your life belongs to the Emperor. Survival means nothing. Honor means everything. Surrender doesn't just disgrace you. It poisons your ancestors and your descendants." American military culture? It was a whole different world. U.S. soldiers learned about the Geneva Convention and their rights as POWs. Japanese soldiers, on the other hand, grew up on stories of American monsters, atrocities, prisoners skinned alive, medical experiments, cannibalism. The irony was almost unbearable. While Japanese soldiers braced for American barbarity, their own military was committing brutal crimes across the Pacific. The Bataan Death March had just happened a few months before Sakamaki's capture. 60,000 Filipino and 15,000 American POWs forced to march 65 miles in heat, barely any food or water, thousands dead by the end. Japanese treatment of Western POWs killed 27% of them, compared to 4% who died in German and Italian camps. But when Sakamaki woke up in a clean hospital bed on Sand Island, American doctors patched him up, nurses brought him food, and officers spoke to him with respect. The shock was almost too much. He begged his captors for permission to kill himself. They refused, patiently, no matter how many times he asked. On March 9th, 1942, Sakamaki arrived at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, the first of nearly 3,000 Japanese POWs who would pass through the biggest Japanese camp in America. The trip from Hawaii through San Francisco, all the way across the continent, was his first real glimpse of American life. Not a cattle car or a freight wagon, but a passenger train with padded seats. Guards, yes, but regular meals 3 times a day. Through the windows, he saw cities blazing with lights, an America he never imagined could exist. No blackout curtains. No air raid drills. Nothing to hint at the all-out war that had swallowed Japan since 1937. People just carried on, almost like Pearl Harbor was a far-off annoyance instead of the catastrophe Japanese propaganda described. when the American military decided to keep most Japanese prisoners of war at Camp McCoy, with a few sent to Camp Kennedy in Rhode Island, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, and Angel Island in California, it wasn't random. They picked spots far from the West Coast, where anti-Japanese feelings were highest, and in places starving for farm labor. Camp McCoy itself stretched across 60,000 acres of Wisconsin countryside. For Japanese prisoners, used to their packed homeland, the sheer space was overwhelming. The place started as a training ground but got a quick makeover when prisoners started arriving from the Pacific. By 1944, it held Germans, Italians, and Japanese, each group fenced into its own area. Colonel Harold Rogers ran the place, following orders straight from Washington. Treat Japanese prisoners exactly as the Geneva Convention demanded, no matter how Japan treated American captives. Rogers later admitted that was one of the toughest rules he ever had to enforce, knowing what Americans faced in Japanese camps. The Japanese were kept in Compound 3, separated from the others by double fences and barbed wire. Each barrack had 50 men in real beds, mattresses, sheets, blankets, the kind of comfort they'd never even imagined after sleeping in caves back in the Pacific. The buildings had electric lights, hot water, flush toilets, and central heating, which made Wisconsin's winters bearable. The camp hospital was a shock, especially for the Japanese medical staff. They were used to shortages and improvising with nothing, but here they found x-ray machines, surgical tools, and shelves stocked with medicine, including the new miracle drug, penicillin. But nothing rattled the Japanese prisoners more than the food. 3 times a day, they got meals bigger than anything Japanese civilians had seen since 1940. The daily ration, 2,800 calories, matched what U.S. soldiers ate: meat, vegetables, bread, butter, coffee, and sometimes dessert. The camp even brought in rice and soy sauce when they heard about Japanese food preferences. Imagine your enemy asking what you'd like to eat. For men who'd starved in the army, it was almost too much to process. The kitchen itself blew their minds. Japanese prisoners assigned to cooking found electric mixers, massive refrigerators, and gas stoves that could feed thousands. The technology was years ahead of anything back home. And the waste? Food thrown out every day because regulations required them to cook more than enough. It was hard to believe. Then there was the camp chapel. The Americans didn't just let the Japanese practice their religion. They actually encouraged it. They set up a Buddhist shrine with incense, all provided by the YMCA. American Christians supplying what was needed for Buddhist worship for enemy soldiers. The Japanese could hold daily services, celebrate holidays, even perform funeral rites for the few who died. It flew in the face of everything they'd been told about American barbarism. One shock after another. Japanese-American soldiers, the Nisei, worked as interpreters and guards. Some came from the famous 442nd Regimental Combat Team, or Military Intelligence Service. Their own families were locked up in internment camps, yet they still served the Army with pride. By summer 1944, the labor shortage on American farms meant Japanese prisoners started working the fields across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Iowa. Unlike the brutal forced labor Japanese soldiers had imposed on Allied prisoners in places like the Burma Railway, where 12,000 Allied captives died, the Americans paid Japanese prisoners the same pay as German or Italian prisoners. Out in the fields, the prisoners saw a level of agricultural abundance they couldn't wrap their heads around. A single Wisconsin farm could outproduce entire Japanese prefectures. Mechanical harvesters, electric milking machines, automated feed systems. American farms ran on technology that let one farmer do the work of dozens of Japanese peasants. Against this backdrop, Japanese prisoners of war and American farmers started off wary of each other. But things changed slowly. Many of these farmers had sons fighting in the Pacific, yet they treated the Japanese prisoners with a basic decency. They shared lunch, taught them how to run American farm equipment, sometimes even invited them for dinner. Rules against fraternizing be damned. By the end of 1944, Camp McCoy rolled out educational programs for Japanese prisoners. They could take English, American history, math, and science. The camp library, packed with books in several languages, including Japanese, became a haven for soldiers who'd been stuck with nothing but military manuals for years. There were job training courses, too. Some prisoners took English classes that would actually help them later, when they went home to a changed Japan. American newspapers and magazines made their way into camp, even with the usual wartime blackouts and edits. Still, they offered a glimpse of democracy that clashed with everything Japanese soldiers had been taught. Christmas 1944 upended a lot of assumptions. American church groups, clubs, and even families sent Christmas packages, not just for Christian prisoners, but for Buddhists and Shintoists too. Every Japanese prisoner got something: cigarettes, candy, toiletries, warm socks, a hand-knitted scarf. The gifts came with cards, some obviously written by kids, hoping for peace and a safe return home. The Christmas dinner? Unbelievable. Turkey, ham, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, pie. Food that most hadn't seen since before World War I back in Japan. Prisoners could go to Christmas services in the chapel if they wanted. Some went just to see. They listened to prayers for peace and for every soldier's safe return, including the enemies. The Germans in the next compound offered another reality check. They moved around, freely organized sports, put on plays, ran camp newspapers. They treated captivity as an annoyance, not a disgrace. At first, Japanese prisoners refused to give their names, only their serial numbers. But the Germans chatted with guards, wrote letters home, made plans for after the war. Their casual attitude, no shame, no talk of suicide, began to rub off on the Japanese. Supervised sports matches brought Germans, Italians, and Japanese together. These games showed the Japanese that being a prisoner didn't have to be a mark of ultimate dishonor, not the way their own military culture insisted. One thing challenged Japanese military indoctrination more than anything: mail. The camp staff encouraged Japanese prisoners to write home through the International Red Cross. Most refused at first, convinced their families believed they died honorably in battle. But the Americans kept pushing, explaining their rights. When the first replies arrived in early 1945, everything shifted. Families wrote back with relief and happiness, not shame. Soon, dozens of prisoners started writing home. American censors, surprisingly relaxed, let them describe daily life, their health, even camp conditions. That level of honesty, enemies allowing open communication, collided with years of Japanese warnings about American deceit. Then, in April 1945, the invasion of Okinawa hit the newsstands in the camp library. Newspapers covered everything: casualties, setbacks, mistakes. It was a kind of transparency totally foreign to soldiers raised on Japanese propaganda, where only victories made the headlines. Even more shocking, the papers describe American troops risking their own safety to protect Okinawan civilians. Back home in Japan, the military swore Americans would slaughter everyone. But here were stories about Marines evacuating people from battle, doctors treating wounded civilians, engineers setting up water supplies for refugees. When Okinawan civilians showed up in mainland camps, captured and alive, their own stories shattered the myth that Americans would wipe out the Japanese population. These first-hand stories from other Japanese prisoners chipped away at the old military mindset. On August 6, 1945, news of the Hiroshima bombing hit American newspapers, which the prisoners could read. At first, they just didn't believe it. A single bomb wiping out a whole city? Impossible. But then came Nagasaki, just 3 days later. No denying it now. Emotionally, it was a whirlwind. There was horror at the destruction, sure, but also a kind of stunned respect for American technological power. And, oddly enough, relief. The war would end, and the nightmare invasion, where millions were expected to die, wouldn't happen. What really stood out, though, was how the Americans reacted. Instead of celebrating, people seemed sobered, almost haunted by what they'd done. The camp held special services. Chaplains prayed for the victims and said they hoped such weapons would never be used again. That moment, Americans mourning Japanese dead, shattered the last bits of propaganda about their supposed barbarism. Then, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's surrender was announced. The news reached Camp McCoy through American newspapers. The Japanese prisoners had been sure they'd fight until the last person, so the surrender hit like an earthquake. Suddenly, nothing made sense. And the Americans? Their response was just as surprising. There was no gloating, no abuse, no cutting rations or privileges. If anything, the guards seemed more worried about the prisoners' well-being. They set up suicide watches and offered counseling. Colonel Rogers even came to speak to them directly, using interpreters. The war's over. You'll go home when we can get you there. Until then, we'll protect you. Any guard who mistreats you will be punished. You came here as enemies, but you'll leave as future friends. That fall brought new worries. Many Japanese prisoners, especially those captured early, were scared to go back. Their time in America had changed them. They'd learned to think differently, and they knew Japan was in ruins. Plus, they might be seen as tainted just for surviving. The camp started repatriation programs, teaching them skills they'd need to help rebuild. Construction, electrical work, modern farming, basic medicine. The American military, having defeated Japan, now trained Japanese prisoners to rebuild it. Before they left, the prisoners got surplus clothes, shoes, basic supplies, and even money for the journey, funds from the country that had beaten them, to help them start again. In December 1945, the trip home began. They took trains to West Coast ports, then ships to Japan. That train ride was their last glimpse of American plenty. Cities shifting from war to peace, farms getting ready for harvest, families welcoming soldiers home. In San Francisco, they boarded ships alongside American occupation troops. Former enemies sharing the same destination, now headed to rebuild Japan from opposite sides. The crossing took about 2 weeks. On board, the Japanese prisoners wrote letters to American friends, farmers, teachers, even guards, letters that later ended up in archives, showing how much they'd changed. They landed in Yokohama in January 1946. Japan was even worse than they feared. Cities were burned out, people were starving, and American forces ran everything. The prisoners, healthy and well-fed after their time in America, looked out of place among the thin, hungry crowds. Homecoming was complicated. Some families were overjoyed, others felt shame. Military leaders often saw the returnees as tainted and told some to commit suicide to wipe away their dishonor. But the Americans saw things differently. They realized these men could help. They spoke English, understood American ways, and weren't filled with hate. Many found work as interpreters or advisors, helping to bridge the gap between occupiers and locals. In the end, these returned prisoners became unexpected agents of change. Their experience with American farming, industry, and democracy made them valuable during Japan's Reconstruction. They helped push the country toward democratization and modernization, using what they'd learned to rebuild a broken nation. A lot of people in post-war Japan really made their mark because they understood how the Americans thought and operated. Take Kazuo Sakamaki, for example, the first prisoner of war. When he got back to Japan, he joined Toyota. Thanks to his English and his grasp of American ways, he helped turn Toyota into a major player in the global car market. By 1969, he was running Toyota's branch in Brazil. That kind of career just wouldn't have happened without his POW experience. He retired in 1987, lived until 1999, and mostly kept quiet about the war, except for a 1991 conference where he saw his old submarine again, now sitting in a Texas museum. Former POWs brought back more than just stories. They introduced American farming techniques that completely changed Japanese agriculture. Some started businesses modeled on what they'd seen in the States. Others taught English, shared Western customs, or advised government ministries on democratic reforms. They told people that Americans weren't the monsters wartime propaganda made them out to be, but possible partners for peace. The education Japanese POWs got in American camps made a real difference back home. The guys who spent time in camp libraries realized just how important education was for democracy and for rebuilding the economy. Reading uncensored newspapers in the camps also made them rethink the role of the press. When they came back, some of them became journalists in occupied Japan, pushing for the kind of transparency they'd seen in American news coverage. This exposure to new ideas and ways of doing things helped these former prisoners play a big part in Japan's leap from a militaristic empire to a democratic society. Their experiences helped bridge that massive gap between defeat and rebuilding. But honestly, the deepest impact of being a POW in America wasn't about technology or knowledge. It was moral. Japanese soldiers grew up believing that mercy was a weakness. In America, they saw that strength could come from a sense of moral confidence, from treating even enemies with humanity and not worrying that it would cost you victory. For many, this hit harder than any cruelty could have. If Americans had been cruel, it would have confirmed everything Japanese propaganda said. Kindness, though, threw all that out the window. And as the truth came out about how Japan treated Allied prisoners, Bataan, the Burma Railway, all the horror stories, many former POWs felt a deep, complicated shame. Some even started to rethink who they were and what their country stood for. There were other surprises. 2. In American camps, Japanese prisoners saw women, nurses, administrators, all sorts of staff, doing jobs they'd never see women do back home. Some POWs even worked on farms where women ran the show while the men were off at war. Seeing American women take on these roles made some of the returned POWs question the limits placed on women in Japan. They realized that America's productivity partly came from using everyone's talents, not just half the population. These lessons about gender stuck with them, and ended up feeding into Japan's own changes in the decades that followed. It wasn't just farming or gender roles. Either, Japanese POWs saw that American efficiency came from systems, not just from individual genius. They learned about preventive maintenance, how Americans took care of their equipment before it broke, not after. They kept strict schedules for oil changes, inspections, and parts replacements. This approach made a big impression and ended up shaping how Japanese factories worked after the war. Even religion was affected. In American camps, Buddhist POWs could practice freely, and this experience made them push for religious tolerance and separating religion from state power back home. Radical ideas in a country dominated by state Shinto. The kindness shown by American Christians at Christmas left a mark, too. Not many converted, but a lot grew to respect Christian charity, which helped smooth things over when American missionaries showed up during the occupation. Then there were the letters. POWs in American camps got mail from family that shattered the myths they'd heard from the military about surrender being shameful. Wives wrote about how glad they were their husbands were alive. Parents said they'd rather have a living son than a dead hero. Kids just wanted their dads home. These messages turned a lot of POWs thinking upside down and made them put family above career, something pretty rare in Japanese corporate life. Living in America taught them something simple but powerful. Family men could succeed. American farmers and guards talked about their families nonstop. They showed photos, talked about reunions after the war. For them, family wasn't a weakness, it was everything. It gave them strength. American military psychologists took a close look at Japanese prisoners. Their research shaped the way America ran the occupation after the war. They noticed big psychological changes in Japanese prisoners who got humane treatment and new ideas. Most Japanese POWs showed up with that old death before dishonor mindset, so intense, they often needed suicide prevention for months. But after a while, with better treatment, some education, and exposure to new perspectives, the change was clear. These men started to see the world differently. This wasn't just academic. These findings shaped huge post-war changes: education reforms, land redistribution, and the new democratic constitution. MacArthur's inner circle even had former POW camp administrators who understood how Japanese soldiers thought, just from watching them in captivity. That background helped them steer clear of actions that might have led to resistance. The influence went deeper, too. Some of Japan's most famous business breakthroughs came from POWs who'd seen American methods up close. The Toyota production system, for example, waste reduction, continuous improvement, respect for workers. These ideas partly came from things Kazuo Sakamaki and other Toyota folks learned while in captivity. Even the convenience store boom in Japan traces back to POWs watching American camp exchanges. Tiny shops, a variety of goods, all super efficient. When these POWs came home, they became cultural go-betweens. They were Japanese, but they'd seen America from the inside, so they could help both countries move from enemies to allies. And this wasn't just official business. Some of them kept in touch with American camp staff, farmers, and families who had shown them kindness. Letters and documents and archives show how these personal bonds help build reconciliation before any formal alliance. Still, POWs face a tough road back in Japan. The military saw surrender as shameful, so most POWs lost out on benefits and got locked out of veterans groups. The irony stung. These men had brought back skills and connections that helped rebuild Japan, but officials treated them as outcasts. It took until the 1970s for POW associations to form, to push for recognition and finally share their stories. After Emperor Hirohito died in 1989, the last bits of imperial-era stigma faded. Former POWs began speaking out, shaping how Japan understood its own wartime history and its relationship with America. Their kids often turn out different, too. In a pretty conformist Japan, POW's children questioned authority, valued individuality, and chased international careers. The grandchildren took it further. Many studied abroad, especially in the U.S., inspired by family stories about unexpected kindness from former enemies. These personal ties and exchanges kept Japanese-American relations strong across generations. Academics in Japan dug into the POW experience as a unique way to understand both American society and Japanese psychology. They kept finding the same patterns. At first, a wish for death, then slow acceptance of survival, a craving for education, shifts in worldview, and anxiety about returning home. This research led to changes in military education, scrapping the old death before dishonor training, and adding Geneva Convention lessons. It showed that even the deepest indoctrination could break down under humane treatment. American scholars paid attention, too. They saw in the Japanese POW experience an example of how people can change, how beliefs shift through what you live, not just what you're told. When the 50th anniversary of the war's end rolled around in 1995, people finally listened. Japanese and American veterans shared stories, especially about the surprising kindness that helped turn enemies into allies. These moments helped both sides see just how tangled and human their shared history really was. Kazuo Sakamaki's trip back to America in 1991 for a history conference grabbed headlines for a reason. His story, like so many others, showed how much can change when you look your enemy in the eye and see something unexpected. Maybe even a friend. When the first Japanese POW visited his old submarine, now a museum piece after half a century, the moment just stopped you in your tracks. The look on his face, broadcast around the world, cut through years of history and turned former enemies into people you could actually understand. These commemorations, simple as they might seem, helped younger generations see that enemies don't have to stay enemies. Even in captivity, real connections can start to grow. Take the story of Japanese POWs who braced themselves for cruelty but found kindness instead. That became a big part of how people started talking about post-war reconciliation. And it's not just history now. Descendants of those POWs and the American guards who watched over them still keep in touch, nearly 80 years later. Most of the people who lived through that time are gone, but their families keep coming together, trading stories and remembering how things shifted from hatred to friendship. Places like the Camp McCoy History Center hold on to that legacy. The archives there are packed with artifacts, letters, and photos from former prisoners and their families. More and more of it gets digitized every year, opening the door for researchers everywhere to dig into a story of how enemies really can change. There are still educational exchanges between Japanese and American communities, some directly linked to those wartime experiences. Students learn, not from lectures about conquest, but from real-life stories of kindness turning enemies into friends, a lesson that's not going out of style anytime soon. The numbers themselves tell a story. Around 5,000 Japanese POWs ended up in camps on the U.S. mainland, out of 35,000 to 50,000 captured by Western allies. Most spent the war in Australia or New Zealand. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, was the biggest U.S. camp, holding up to 3,000 Japanese prisoners. There were others, too. Camp Kennedy in Rhode Island, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Angel Island in California. Daily rations matched what U.S. soldiers got, 2,800 calories. POWs earned 80 cents a day working in the fields. And the mortality rate? In U.S. camps, it was extremely low. Compare that to the staggering 27% death rate for Allied POWs in Japanese camps. Hardly anyone tried to escape. Most just didn't see the point. After the war, many POWs kept in touch with Americans they'd met. The Japanese POW experience in America during World War II isn't just some footnote. It's a powerful lesson on how to resolve conflict and rebuild peace. The Americans stuck to international law, even when the other side didn't. Treating your enemy better than they ever treated you wasn't just the right thing to do. It worked. When those POWs went home, they ended up spreading the word about American kindness, undercutting anti-American propaganda far more than any official campaign ever could. There was an economic ripple, too. Japan's post-war boom had a lot to do with former POWs who brought American ideas and business ties back home. Some big Japanese companies even hired these men for their American know-how. But honestly, the real victory wasn't strategic or economic. It was moral. By showing decency instead of force, America proved the strength of democracy. Watching Japanese POWs go from fanatical enemies to grateful allies is proof that kindness can do what violence never will. These men, who thought dying was the only honorable option, ended up learning there's more dignity in living well and working for peace. Their journey from bushido warriors to democratic citizens showed that enemies can change. The kindness those POWs experienced planted seeds that grew into one of the world's strongest alliances. Modern Japan-U.S. relations rest on that transformation from bitter enemies to real partners. The chaplain who prayed for the enemy dead. The farmers who ate lunch with POWs in the fields. The families who sent Christmas gifts to men once called the enemy. Ordinary people, just doing the right thing, ended up changing the world in ways military victories never could. Now, when the news is full of hopeless conflicts and talk of eternal enemies, the Japanese POW story still shines. It proves that kindness outlasts cruelty, that mercy beats vengeance, that even when the past is ugly, tomorrow's allies are waiting, if we treat each other like people. The Japanese soldiers who expected torture but found compassion, who thought they'd die but got a second chance, who arrived as enemies and left as friends, they're living proof that humanity can break the cycle. Their journey from attacking Pearl Harbor to helping rebuild Japan with American support reminds us, with a little courage and principle, even the darkest chapters can end in hope. America's biggest win in the Pacific War wasn't just about beating the Japanese military. It was something deeper, a moral victory. When American guards treated Japanese prisoners of war with unexpected kindness, they did more than just defeat an enemy on the battlefield. They showed that democracy could change even those who once saw Americans as monsters. About 5,000 Japanese prisoners lived on American soil, and thousands more stayed in Allied camps. When they went home, they carried memories of decency and fairness, not just defeat. They became living proof that it's possible to plant seeds of democracy and friendship in ground once hardened by hate. Their stories, some tucked away in archives, others passed down in families, still remind us that enemies don't have to stay enemies. Breaking the cycle of hate takes guts, but it's possible. We shouldn't remember this chapter of history as just some strange footnote. It's a lesson, a blueprint for how to deal with conflict even today. If Japanese soldiers, raised to believe death was better than surrender, could return home as believers in democracy because they experienced kindness, then who's to say others can't change too? It's not just about grand gestures, either. American Guard protected prisoners who wanted to die. Doctors healed wounded enemies. Teachers taught men who once saw them as the enemy. Chaplains prayed for the souls of those on the other side. Ordinary people, doing their jobs with compassion, created a victory that's lasted far longer than any battle. Their story keeps inspiring us. Real strength isn't about crushing your enemies. It's about changing them, showing by example a better way. Those Japanese prisoners expected torture but found kindness. They arrived thinking they'd die and left with hope. They showed that democracy's real power comes from turning enemies into friends, not through force, but by example. Kindness did what violence never could. The story didn't end with a flag planted in conquered ground, but with lives and minds changed. The Japanese soldiers who bombed Pearl Harbor and ended up in American prison camps encountered something stronger than any weapon. the humanity of their captors. That experience reshaped what they believed about strength, honor, and what it means to be human. You see the legacy of that kindness today in business deals, student exchanges, and alliances between Japan and America. The friendships that grew out of POW camps 80 years ago are still building bridges, growing stronger every year. Even in the darkest moments of war, humanity can break through, and that's something worth remembering.